Hi everyone, Rabbi Sandy Zisser here. We're going to be looking at the Torah today, at the book of Bereishit, which is the first book of the Torah. Bereishit in English is Genesis. It is the beginning of the Torah. There are 5 books in the Torah. Bereishit, which is Genesis, Shmot, which is Exodus, Vayikra, which is Leviticus, Bamidbar, which is Numbers, and Devarim, which is Deuteronomy. Today we're looking at the first book of the Torah, Genesis, and the beginning. Each book of the Torah has different chapters in it. These parshiot, these parshas, these Torah portions are divided into chapter, verse. But the first book of each of the books of the Torah, the first portion in it is usually the same name as the overall book. So looking into Bereishit today, into Genesis, you are looking at the first portion, the first part of the Torah is Bereishit as well. So it begins. And of course I have in front of me here the different sources that I'm looking at. We'll be taking my glasses on and off to see you and to see the books, but I will be looking down a lot as we're teaching and going through this because my sources are in front of me here. So we begin in the beginning, okay, in Bereishit. Bereishit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, right? In the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth and everything in it. And the earth and the world is just desolate. There's nothing there. Okay? And God breathes into existence everything we know. Now, the interesting thing is that it's hard for people to comprehend this idea of there being nothing. Okay? Nothing before everything. And the idea for us is that creation is broken into 7 days of creation. Each day, different things are created. Okay? And, the first day, there's light and darkness is created. The second day is the separation of the waters. The third day is land and vegetation is created. The fourth day, the sun, the moon, and the stars come into existence. The fifth day, you have the creatures, small creatures and birds and fish that are created. The sixth day, animal and man as a species are created. And then the seventh day is that abstaining from work day, is that rest day that God takes. Now, at the beginning, the first thing you're going to think about for Bereishit is, well, there's this total contradiction between science and religion, right? That's what you're going to ask, right? Because how can the world be created in 7 days? There's nowhere in the book of the Torah of Bereishit that states that creation took 7 physical days. If you think about it, time and calendars are man-created. Okay? The calendar system doesn't come about till the Egyptian period, right? The Egyptians. So the time that's prescribed for these days could actually have been millions of years. Right? We use it as a term that we can understand. So the idea is that it's very possible and very probable that none of this happens actually in 7 days, okay? Even for God, right? So when asked, Rambam, who was Moses Maimonides, who was a great physician, rabbi, thinker, philosopher, commentary for the Torah and other works, he was asked, he lived in medieval Spain, he's asked, isn't there a contradiction between you being a scientist and a rabbi? And in his point of view, it goes together hand in hand. And for our purposes, it does too. Okay, what you'll notice is that in the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth, and when the earth was empty, darkness, there was nothing right around, and God breathes into this, and with words. Okay, God says, "Vayhi or," and let there be light. And then, lo and behold, Yehi or, there is light. Okay, and all of a sudden, what occurs is that God sees that the light is good, and God separates light from darkness, and God calls out to the light, and calls it day, and God calls out to the night and calls it the darkness and calls it night. And then that's the first day of creation. There's morning, there's evening, and it's a one day. The beauty of creation is that God, if we take God as this all-powerful being, God still uses words to create. There's still this idea of having to do something, as opposed to God just thinking it or magically appearing somewhere. This idea that it's brought into existence using words. Okay? Again, there's no real purpose for that, because in the beginning, if there's nothing, there's always God. Right? God was there regardless of time, place, and anything else. It's a concept that the human mind can't actually comprehend. First of all, the human mind can't really wrap our brains around the idea of there never being anything, of nothingness, right? And in that nothingness, there's God. How's that possible, right? So this whole purpose of God being and always has been, right, is a concept that just needs to be taken, okay? And by the way, the question that comes out of this, where it says that Vayi Boker, Vayi Erev Vayi Boker Yom Echad, right? That there was evening and there was morning, one day, Yom Echad, one day, right? Rashi, who was probably the greatest medieval commentary on the Torah, actually probably the greatest commentary still on the Torah, asks this question. He says, why does the Torah say one day and not the first day? Right? Because, and Rashi, of course, then answers that question, is that to fit with the context of the chapter, the verse should have said the first day, right? But it's written regarding the other days, right? The more we look into it, you'll see is that it says it was evening and then it was morning, the second day, then third day, fourth day, but the first day it says one as opposed to not, because God was, Rashi says, alone, right? Nothing's created, and this explains this idea that it's one day, it's a day, right? There was no second, right? You can't have the second annual barbecue for 4th of July until you have the first one, right? It's not the first annual, right? Usually it's the second annual. The first is special. The first is the first. It's one. Okay, so the idea here is that God's alone, right? It's this great look at this when human beings have this fear of being alone, right? And God uses this terminology of being alone, okay? Many times in creation, which we're going to take a look at later on when God is creating humans, right? The human being. God says on that day, that let us make God. Right? God said, "Let us make man in our image, right, like us." Right, and then of course you get this idea of who's God talking to at this moment, but also the idea that once man is created, God says it's not good for man to be alone, and God eventually will create a female for this male. Right? There's these ideas that go on in this creation story. You can spend a long time studying this creation story. I'm going to point out also that the Torah texts themselves are not, shouldn't be limited to the videos that you're going to be having in this series. Okay? You should spend time delving into them. We study them year after year, over and over and over again, purposely, because there's always something new to find. I teach a Parsha class every week. There's always something new every year for me to learn myself personally. I've been doing this job for a while, and there's more for me to learn each time, because there's never an end to studying, just like there's never an end to the Torah itself. And by looking at that, there's this amazing thing. Okay? So I wanted to point out something. Today, most people recognize that the beginning of the Torah, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay? I would say that the majority of people in the world know that phrase. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the earth. Right? and the Spirit of God moved over the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. I would say the majority of people know this story. Okay? The three English words in the beginning, right, stand for one Hebrew word, Bereishit, okay, which is made of two words, Be, meaning in, and Reishit, meaning the head of. Rosh, okay, is the thing, or the start of. Okay, so when you're looking at this idea that in the beginning is important, because for God there may never be actually a beginning of anything or an end to something, right? For humankind there is. Okay? There's also a piece here of what of the creation itself. Okay, so the beginning of it is light and darkness are created first. Okay, then you go into this idea that the separation of the waters, meaning the waters from above and below, are separated. Then land is created. Right, the waters are pulled back, and there's water. The waters pull back, and land appears, and then there is vegetation that grows on the land. Okay, you have the sun, the moon, and the stars that are created on the fourth day. Okay, and of course it does say there are two large luminaries. Right, there are two large bodies in the sky. One for the daytime, one for the nighttime. The sun for the day, and the moon to rule over at night, and the stars that are there too. Obviously, if you think about it, what we know about astronomy today, the sun, the moon, and the stars. The stars are other planets or other stars themselves or other suns. The writing of the Torah itself doesn't address that part. Again, probably because of the time period in which this is given to mankind or written by mankind, they had no knowledge, or their brains couldn't handle that part of it. Okay, the fourth day of creation, the small creatures and the fish and the birds are created. Okay, the sixth day, animals and man. Okay? And one of the things, the mystery here of God's name is also brought into question throughout this first book, this first story of creation. Right, God is called Elohim, right? A name that comes from the Hebrew word El. Okay? The word that meant God in many languages in the Near East. In Hebrew, the word Elohim looks and sounds like the plural of El. Right? The singular of Elohim is Elohah. Okay? And the Bible sometimes, but not often, uses Elohah as a name for the one God. Right? So we see this, Bereishit bara Elohim, right? That you can tell from the first sentence that Elohim is the name and not a word meaning many gods. So it's pointing out right away that it's the God doing this. Okay? And what you have also is, if you read into this story and you get past the sixth day and the seventh day, there's a piece here that it almost starts over. There's almost a second creation story here. Okay, it starts on verse 4, right, in this chapter, in the second chapter. It says, these are the stories, these are the generations of the skies and the earth when they were created. And then it actually details it a little bit more. Right? It gives you more details about the creation of man and woman. Okay? So it gives you the idea of the Garden of Eden, the idea of what happens with Adam and Eve, the expulsion from the garden happens in this first book of the Torah. There's many pieces here. So for a long time people thought that the first creation story, which is the general creation story, the idea of the 7 days of creation, is a generic picture. Right? It shows you that God created the world, and that the second story, the story that has Adam and Eve, the story that has the Garden of Eden, the story that has the first humans' interaction with other animals, and the screw up that they do, and what happens after that, is the detail. There are people that don't see it as an issue. There are people that don't have this as a problem. The first story, God uses words to create things, and God is distant and separate from the earth and the heavens. God makes humans, and in the second story, though, there's an interaction, right? There's a different name for God in the second story, right? We use the word, excuse me, we use the word Adonai for God. Okay, surely these two stories of creation are not told at the same time, probably either, right? Or in the same place. But what you have is this very personal God in the second part of the story. Okay, and why do we need both stories? It's possible that you need it for the beginning and you need it for the end. You need this idea of having the awe-inspiring, great, creation, but then there's the smaller creation, the day-to-day piece, the part that introduces the human nature of things. All right, so you're looking then at this. Okay, so when you have this creation of man and woman, when you're in the second chapter, okay, it's adding more information. The first creation of man is in chapter 1, verse 27, okay, where it says, God created man by hand in the mold which was made for him. The mold which God used to create man resembled the image of God. On that day he created both male and female. Okay. Okay, so there's that piece. Then you get to the second part, and the Torah now adds further details concerning the creation of man and woman, which is mentioned beforehand. Okay, so the vegetation is growing, and God puts in the garden, right? He puts the man in this garden. It's Eden, and he plants a garden and has the rivers flowing out of it, and there's a detail here that is in chapter 2. Okay, and God says in chapter 2, verse 18, God Almighty God says, all right, it's not good for man to be alone. I'll make him a helpmate. Okay, and anything in this garden is for the man. Okay, it's all there. And the man actually is given the task of naming all the animals, and as tradition goes, but the man, Adam, can't find a mate, right? A person who's suitable for him. So then God says it's not good for Adam to be alone, and wants to create a helpmate for him. Okay. What happens then is that there's the man and woman, they're created, and they're in chapter 3 in Bereishit. It's stated they're both naked, and the man and the woman, but they're not ashamed because they don't know to be different. Okay, and then there's introduced the next character in the story, right, is the snake and the serpent. Okay, and it says here that the serpent is more cunning than any other beast that God has created for some reason, and in this garden, God plants these two trees: the tree of knowledge, right, which they're not allowed to eat from. Now, many scholars have addressed this point, and if people who have kids or parents know this also, this piece, or just human nature in general. if you don't want someone to touch something, you don't put it in front of them, right? If you have a recovering alcoholic, you don't say, "Here, hold my drink while I go to the bathroom." There are pieces of it that you don't do for people because it's too much for them, right? So here you have God, and God plants in this garden, right, the tree of knowledge, of good and evil, right, and says you can eat from any other tree in the garden, but not this one, right? And of course, that one's made to be the most appealing because of that. So the serpent, right, the snake comes along and says to the woman, right, so what's with the tree? He basically talks her into having this conversation with him. And he says, so what's with the tree? Right, you're not allowed to eat from any of the trees in the garden? And she says, no, we're allowed to eat from the trees when we want to, except we can't touch that one, the one that's in the middle of the garden. We can't touch that one, because if we do, we're going to die. Okay? And the serpent says to the woman, "Come on, you're not going to die. Don't worry about it. Seriously, And the serpent, the snake, convinces the woman to go take a bite. Now, in popular mythology and popular, paintings and things, the fruit of the tree of knowledge is an apple. Okay? There's no sign in the Torah itself that the fruit is actually an apple. Okay, in fact, it doesn't really tell you anything about the fruit that she eats, but she does eat it, and her eyes are opened, and all of a sudden, the knowledge of good and evil is there for her. It's there for her taking, and it's something that she then convinces Adam to eat, right? And the man and the woman eat from the tree of knowledge, and oh my God, all of a sudden they realize they're naked. Okay, and what they do is they hear, God coming, right, in the garden. Now it's interesting what that means. Okay, and then God says to asks where they are, and they hide because they're naked, right? And at this time, he, God says, "Where are you?" Right? And Adam, the man, and Eve, eventually her name will be, right, because he names her, they hide because they're afraid. And they heard God coming. And God says, "You're hiding because you're naked. So who told you that you were naked?" And then God says, "Did you eat from the tree that I told you not to eat from?" Now, here's an interesting question. If we go by the idea that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, right? God would know that this happened. In fact, God would know that this was going to happen before it happened, right? So it's possible it's showing here that that God is not this all-powerful, almighty God that knows what's going on, or God's trying to teach a point, okay? So God says, "Who told you you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I told you not to eat from?" And the man, in classic man fashion, says, "Well, the woman gave me the fruit, right, to eat, and I ate it." And then God turns to the woman, turns to Eve, and says, "What have you done?" And she says, "It wasn't me. The snake made me do it." Right? So there's this, it's definitely the scene of like one to the other, and the serpent looks around and there's no one to blame, right? So, and God gets really annoyed. And then God says, "Because you've done this to the snake, that you're going to be cursed more than any of the others." Okay, so what happens is that apparently at this point in time, the snake was able to walk, right? It had legs. God removes the snake's legs and makes the snake crawl on its belly, okay, and eat the soil all the days of its life. And then there's a hatred that's put between humankind, and the snake, apparently the snake's offspring. And man, God says, "Man will crush you on the head, and you will bite his heel." Okay. Then God turns to the woman and says, "I will greatly increase your anguish, your pain in bearing children, and your labor pains for pregnancy will be great. You will give birth to children in pain, and you will deserve to be with your husband. And you'll desire to be with your husband, but he's going to rule over you." Okay, so the punishment that the woman gets is that childbearing will be painful, but yet you'll still want to have kids. Okay, so it'll be a repeated piece, which we sometimes see when women go through excruciating labor, yet they have more than one kid because of the desire to have the kids. Okay, and then God turns to the man and says, "Since you listened to your wife and ate from the tree, and even though I told you not to eat it, you're going to be cursed by having to work for your food. Okay? And you're going to have to till the soil and eat from it all the days of your life, and there you will have, when you sow your seeds, thorns and thistles will grow with your crops, and you will eat the herbs of the field, and from the sweat of your brow, from you working, will you eat bread, and you will have to." And then he also tells them that until you go back to the earth from where you were taken. Right. So at this point in time, God says to them that you are going to die. There'll be a time in your life where you die, for you are from the soil, and to the soil you will return. So it makes sense that to this point in time, that Adam and Eve, man and woman, were immortal. There was no death until this point where God said that eventually you will return to the earth that you came from. Okay? And then they're expelled from the garden, and there's an angel placed in front of the gates of the garden so they can't re-enter, and they're off on their own. Adam and Eve, the first thing that happens after they leave the garden is that the man, right? Adam knew his wife Eve. Biblically, the biblical sense of knowing someone is sexual relations, and she conceives and has a son, whose name is Cain. And then she gives birth again to Abel, and Abel is a shepherd, and Cain works the land. Okay, and it's at the and they're living outside the garden. They have to work for their food. They have to do their things, and at the end of a number of days, and the kids grow up, obviously, right? But that's not in the text, right? So we assume that Cain brought some of the fruits of the land and offered it to God, and Abel brings an offering of the firstborn of his flocks to an offering for God, and God turns to Abel and to his offering and accepts those, but Cain and his offerings are not accepted, and Cain becomes very angry when he's rejected, and there's this whole piece, and then what happens is that there's this ultimately in the story, Cain, who in an argument with his brother, Abel kills him, right, in the field. And at this point, God appears and says to Cain, "Where's your brother? Where's Abel, your brother?" And he said, "I don't know. I'm not my brother's guardian, my brother's keeper." Right? And God says, "What have you done? Your brother's blood is crying out to me from the earth." Right? And in the end, he is now cursed. Cain is cursed and marked, right, for this curse, to last for generations to come. Now, it's very possible, I mean, if you think about it, that Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, have never seen someone die before, right? Maybe they didn't even know they could do it, right, or what death meant, returning to the earth. Is it very possible that Cain didn't know that he could kill his brother? It's very 100% possible. Okay, the idea that Abel is killed is the first murder in the Bible, right? The first act of violence in the Bible, in the Torah, and then Cain goes on through his lifetime marked as a marked man, let's say, and the generations afterwards are too. And then there's a piece here of generations of Cain and his offspring knew her other offsprings, and then later on, Adam and Eve again have another son, and they name him Shem, who Shem is, I want to say, replacement for the son they lost, right? And he is, he is again a offspring of Adam and Eve, which actually have implications, because what you have then is the this again procreation piece, this idea that life will continue, right, through the good and the bad times, and what you have then is the end of Bereishit gives the offsprings of Adam, right, and lists the people who come from him. So Shet, who is in place of their lost son, has children. They tell you who they were, what happens, and because what happens when generations are listed in the Torah, as you'll see as we go forward, is that you're getting to someone, right? It's filling in the gaps between the character in one story to the main character of another story. So we begin with the generations of Adam, okay, and then Adam lives for, as it says, 130 years. His sons marry and have sons and daughters, and then Shet lives for 105 years, and then he fathers someone called Enosh, and Enosh then goes to have other people, onward, until you get to the generation of Noah. Okay, and the reason why is because that's who the main character for the next story is, Noah, right? The Noah story. Okay, and it sets it up here at the end of the first book of the Torah that things aren't going so great from humankind. Okay, the idea that Noah is 500 years old, right? A huge amount of time. Again, the time frame for us is not important, right? And then Noah has 3 sons, Shem, Chem, and Yafet. Okay, and what happens at this time period is that corruption of humankind occurs, okay, and man becomes evil, and God doesn't know how to control it, and then God decides that God's going to destroy the entire earth and everything on it, and start over. And that's where the Noah story would pick up next. The idea here for us is that the again, you'll notice if you're reading through the Torah that people live a long time in the beginning. I mean, you're talking about people who lived 780 years, 800 years, 500 years. The time period for the Torah, including the 7 days of creation, is not something to be 100% taken literally, because time is a man-made thing which occurs much later in the Torah story, right? It's not until the Egyptians create the calendar system where time is actually put into place. So what happens in creation here in the beginning may not be what we think of as a day or a year. So I want you to just, as you're reading through the Torah and the pieces, take these times, take these ages, and put them aside for now, and take them as fact, and just go with it. That's not the main part of the stories. Okay? So we go from innocent in creation, right, to the destruction of creation, or the corruption of creation, and then, as we'll see at the end of Bereishit, that God makes this decision that it's time to do something about it, right? To make it be that I have to start over again. What you'll see is that God, if you look at God as a parent, right? Parents make mistakes. Okay? Parents are not always 100% correct all the time. Sometimes you screw up more with your first child than with your second because you've never done it before. If you look at God as that type of parent, then you're looking at a parent who needs practice. And we don't want to say that about God so much sometimes, but it's true. So that's the first book of Bereishit. I suggest that you read through it, get a chumash, a book that has commentary in it. I will recommend a few that I have here that I like, and go with it that way. And I hope you enjoy the videos, and come back for the next one soon.